It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
Welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert. Glad you're joining us today. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about several things related to the University of Louisville. We're going to be talking to a Grawmeyer Award winner. He was the Grawmeyer Award winner in education. They'll talk about the book that was won and got them the Grawmeyer Award. It's actually a couple that followed 800 children in Baltimore from kindergarten to adulthood to see what difference education made in those kids' lives. And I think you will be surprised and, frankly, disappointed by what they found. But we'll talk to that couple coming up later on in the show. But first, Tim Capps is the director of U of L's Equine Industry Program. He loves Derby time when he gets a spotlight to talk about U of L's program as well as issues surrounding horse racing, the thoroughbred industry, and the Kentucky Derby. So welcome, Tim.
Good morning. Good hat.
Yeah,
well,
good
okay,
evening.
I'll find a voice
Good
at some
evening.
point.
There you go.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, something, Mark. Good to be with you.
It's always good to see you. And Tim, just so you know, you have a background in journalism and reporting. And so why don't you talk about your background first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the program at U of L.
I was a journalism major in college, and maybe I shouldn't say this on air, but I was University of Tennessee.
That's fine.
In Kentucky puts you in bad quarters with some people.
Not at the University of Louisville. We don't care about Tennessee.
Well, I did it actually because I had a great high school English teacher who suggested maybe I want to take a look at this. I had no idea what I wanted to do in college or beyond, and she suggested it. So that's how I ended up being a journalism major, and it turned out to be good for me in a lot of ways. It's something that's been valuable to me no matter what I've done in life.
And so how'd you get interested in horse racing? How'd you make the transition?
Very early age, and I can't really tell you why. I think I was about 6 or 7, and I read a couple of books. I was a geek as a kid, so library a lot, read a couple of books that got me really interested. We were living in New Orleans at the time, strange city for me. I didn't have many friends at that point, so I just read a lot of books and happened to see the Kentucky Derby in 1953. I'm really dating myself as a kid, and fell in love with Native Dancer, the first American racehorse celebrity television star. And it just triggered, it went from there really for me. So I never really thought I'd make a living doing it. It was just a great hobby. I loved it. My parents indulged me along the way, but I think they thought when I found out about girls, I would kind of go another way, and it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. You stuck with horses, huh?
Well, you know, the girls came along, but
eventually, yeah.
Horses were still slightly more important.
So they give you $2 to go to the window when you were like 10 years old, and the person at the window had to say, "Sorry, son, you have to bring your parents up here to bet."
The real oddity, Mark, was my father was a Southern Baptist minister. Of all things.
I guess he didn't go to the track too much.
Well, he would go. They took me a few times, and I just think they wanted to indulge me, and he was kind of interested. He was a big sports fan anyway, so he thought it was pretty interesting stuff.
But he wasn't drinking the bourbon at the Kentucky
No,
Derby.
he was not doing the bourbon.
Yeah,
Nope.
okay.
Straight Coke. So.
All right. Again, we're talking to Tim Capps, who's the director of the Equine Industry Program at the University of Louisville. Why don't you talk about what the Equine Industry Program is?
Mark, it was jump-started in 1987 by an act of the Kentucky legislature. We had a bunch of legislators from here who had gone out to the University of Arizona where they had a racetrack program and had been to their symposium a couple of times and came home and said, why don't we do something like this in Kentucky? They passed the legislation, put some funding into place for it, and said, U of L, go do this. So the university looked at it and said, let's put it into business college. So it has been part of the business college at U of L since 1987-88 school year. It is the only thing of its type in the world, the only horse program that is in an accredited business college. So all the others around, there are 180-some equine programs in the country in 4-year schools, and all of them are equitation or animal science related. So we're the only business program.
So is it equine or equine?
Equine, technically, but most people say equine.
I always say equine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Little did I know. You'd think on TV all those years I should have said it correctly,
It's hard
right?
to break the habit. Once you start saying equine, it's really hard to break. I've really had to work on that since I've been here.
All right, at the Equine Industry Program at U of L then, what do students learn and what career does that send them towards?
Mark, they're business majors, basically. They're the same as a marketing major or a finance major or what have you. The only exception being that they're going to take 30 hours of our courses, and our courses are all geared toward teaching them about the industry from a business standpoint, how things work, how the firms work, individual firms work, how the industry is shaped in general, how people compete with each other. It's an interesting world, but we're trying to teach it from a business standpoint.
So they would go be what, managers at a track or at Churchill Downs, working at Churchill Downs, something like that?
You name it. We probably have, I couldn't even tell you the number, we probably have 15 former students who work at Churchill. We have people working on major breeding farms, working for publications, horse transportation businesses, whatever. So they're a little bit of every place.
We're talking with Tim Capps, who's the director of UofL's Equine Industry Program, which teaches students some skills they can use to go out and work in the horse industry. Well, let's talk about the horse industry. Tim, what are the things facing the horse industry these days? Is it still casino gambling and those kinds of things, or are there other factors that are causing some problems for the horse industry?
Well, you have to distinguish between pieces of the industry. There's a whole big slug of it out there, which makes up the bulk of it from an economic impact and participation standpoint that's really not racing related. It's the show horse world, recreational riding world, and so forth. A lot of what all parts of it are dealing with is the economy. Is going back to the 2007-8 time period when the numbers were pretty good out there, and then all of a sudden you hit the 2008-09 wall. And so people tended to pull back. One of the things about the horse business is that it's like a disease. It bites you, it stays with you forever. It won't kill you. As I tell the students, it won't kill you, but it can bankrupt you. But most people will not get out because it's something they do for a passion, but they'll scale back a lot, and we saw a lot of that. The racing side, because it's really, it's spectator driven. You're trying to get people to come to the racetrack and participate. Has been in a long-term competitive battle that was brought on by everything from televised sports to the ease of movement, the mobility in society, you name it. And so I'd say probably going back to the 60s, the racing industry found itself in a more competitive world than it had been in before. And that continues today. So the adjustments along the way have been that it's more electronically driven than it used to be. A lot more of the wagering occurs off track rather than on track. And if you were a racetrack marketing manager today, that's one of the greatest marketing challenges in the world is to try to split the
How do you get young fans?
You want to encourage new people. You want to satisfy the older fans you have, and you want to encourage them to do the electronic stuff. At the same time, you want them to come to the racetrack.
Right.
So conundrums everywhere. But I think what we've seen in recent years is there's been a better adjustment to that electronic world. And I think that we've seen the business model change to reflect that, and the numbers today are starting to get better again.
Did having a Triple Crown winner last year help the thoroughbred industry, specifically in Kentucky, but nationwide as well?
I talked to a guy at Reuters about this very thing yesterday. I think essentially it helps you in the near term without question. The visibility the industry gets is much higher. People are talking about it and writing about it who normally don't. So he clearly made some difference for a while. Can you capitalize on it long term? It's a tougher proposition because you only get one every so often. You can't predict it. And from the individual racetrack standpoint, how do they capitalize on a horse who probably will never show up at their racetrack except on television? So it was beneficial without question. One of the things you find when you go back and talk about this from years ago, I've met so many people in the industry in my lifetime who said, I got interested when Secretariat came along. Mm-hmm. It's what got them motivated in the first place, and they became participants in it at some level, and many of them went on to make careers out of it. How much he'll have, American Pharoah, how much impact he'll have on that's hard to know, but some, without question. So in the near term, it has a salutary effect. It certainly won't hurt you. Long term, does it really make a difference in the business?
Yeah, who knows?
One thing that'll happen when his first foals are born next year, they'll be on the nightly news programs initially because everybody remember American Pharoah, his first baby's born, isn't that cute and cuddly and all that. But so it's a positive. Does it turn you around? Does it turn you into something magical?
Yeah. Well, we've got 4 kind of signature industries that people talk about in Kentucky: horses, bourbon, coal, and tobacco. Bourbon's doing really well. Tobacco's going down. Coal's going down. And the horses, how would you say they will fare in the next 10 to 15 years if you had to guess? How is that industry?
Well, when I travel anywhere in the world and tell them I'm from Kentucky, the first thing they know is KFC.
Okay.
And no chicken.
I forgot to add fried chicken.
Yeah, they know chicken and they know horses because they've all heard of the Kentucky Derby and all that. And then it depends on what their predispositions are otherwise. So you're right. Kentucky's has been stabilized, if you will. I just made up a word by some industries that are certainly in general decline. Interestingly enough, during the recession and really before that, Kentucky was gaining market share in the thoroughbred business. gaining from the fact that other places were declining for various reasons, but the stallion population has declined across America because they're breeding so many more mares to these horses. And Kentucky's gained from that. Has that gotten benefit out of it.
That's good.
So we are heading toward a period not very far down the road when Kentucky will probably represent about 50% of the thoroughbred foal crop in North America.
So that's good.
It is. There's been consolidation, but I think that the major operations thrive, and I've seen more new operations start up in the last 3 or 4 years than I'd seen for a while. So I think in that regard, Kentucky is more than holding its own. And, of course, the Derby gets more popular every year.
And last year was a record crowd at the Kentucky
crowd.
Derby. So how much does outside the Derby, you take the Derby and the Oaks away from this community and just talk about in general, what does the horse industry and horse racing mean as an economic impact to Louisville, in particular, and in Kentucky in general?
It's in Kentucky in general, because there's been some recent research on this. Kentucky in general, the horse industry is about a $3.5 billion annual economic impact. A lot of jobs, thousands of jobs, depends on whose figures you want to believe, but somewhere at 60,000 in some figures, 90,000 in others. So it's a big economic driver. It certainly is around Louisville, and beyond just the thoroughbreds. It's saddlebred capital of the world, Shelby County, and so forth. I can't imagine Louisville without the Derby.
So you can't just take that out of the equation.
You well know. You
Yeah.
know, this town turns into Derby
Yeah.
most of the year. It's kind of hard to imagine the city without it. It's a great place to live, but without the Derby, it would be different. But I don't think there's any danger of that happening. The event is so powerful. If you look at the major sporting events in North America, it's got to be in the top 5. You look at the World Series, Super Bowl, whatever, it's in that range in terms of television ratings and the impact it has. People talk about the Derby who know nothing about horse
That's
racing.
true. They have
Yeah.
they have parties all over the United States and all over the world. Let's bring this conversation back around as we wrap up here. We're talking a little bit about the Derby. You've got a former student in the UofL Equine program. Sorry, I mispronounced it.
Well, you can make it Equine right now.
I'll say Equine. I'm going to try and break myself of that habit. The UofL Equine program, and a former soccer player who is working with the favorite in the Kentucky Derby, right?
Jack Sisterson is an young guy from England who came here to play soccer and didn't know about our program until he got here. But he had a horse background, and so he went through our program, played soccer here, was a backup kicker on the football team, and graduated, went to California, and found a job with a guy initially worked for another trainer, then he found a job with a guy named Doug O'Neill. They came here 5 years ago now with a horse named I'll Have Another. And he wins the Derby and wins the Preakness, was champion three-year-old that year. And now they're back with Nyquist, who's undefeated at the top of the class right now, the favorite for the Derby. So it's been a kind of nice run for Jack, and I think he's fully appreciative of it.
And I hope he talks about the University of Louisville every chance he gets.
He does. He plugs us.
Very good. All right.
But he calls it Equine.
Equine. He says Equine?
But he does it with an English accent. So,
so it sounds good
Equine,
when he says it, yeah.
Right.
All right, any final words about the equine industry program before you leave?
Well, we're proud of what we do. We feel like we provide kids with a unique opportunity. They can learn about horses and they can learn about the industry, but they can also learn the business. And so the key for them is they walk out of here with a business degree, which can take them any place they want to go.
All right, very good. Tim Capps, the director of UofL's Equine Industry Program. We got it. All right, thanks, Tim. UofL has these prestigious Grawmeyer Awards that are given out in 5 different categories each year, and one of those categories is education. The winners have ideas or research that are unique and have an impact on the world. That's what the Grawmeyer Awards are all about. So the winners of the Grawmeyer in Education are Carl Alexander and Linda Olson, who wrote a book titled The Long Shadow, Family Background, Disadvantaged Youth, and the Transition to Adulthood, which chronicled the lives of 800 poor children in Baltimore from the time they were kindergartners to adulthood. My UofL colleague, Kim Butterwick, interviewed the winners.
Well, I think first things first, could you all tell me a little bit about the idea that won the Grawmeyer Award, and which you outlined in your book, The Long Shadow?
Well, happy to. So, by way of background, we were involved in this Baltimore research study that lasted for 25 years, in which we identified a group of just under 800 children who were starting first grade in Baltimore City Public Schools back in 1982. And we monitored their life progress all the way through elementary school, middle school, and high school, and then for a decade after high school. So it was a span 25 years from 6 years old to roughly age 28, 29. 800 typical Baltimore school children. And we managed to keep up with them fairly well over that period of time. So we know a lot about how their lives unfolded along the way. And what we wanted to do with this project is to see if we could understand some of the drivers of their different life trajectories. Why do some children who start out in Baltimore move through the educational system successfully and then use that as a springboard for getting good jobs and satisfying careers, whereas other children kind of struggle and stumble along the way, and their lives don't play out with the same kind of success as the others. So in broad terms, that was the goal of this project, to try to, like we were basically flies on the wall, just watching in a systematic way how all this unfolded over that 25-year period. So the book, the purpose of the book was to try to put the pieces together to understand how conditions of life early on in families, in their neighborhoods, and the schools that these children attended moved these children along such different life trajectories. And so it's a study that looks at where they began as a group, cute and cuddly first graders, 6 years old, in relationship to where they wound up as young adults. And we feel as though the book fairly well identifies some of the major experiences along the way that had the effect of kind of moving them along different life paths. So that was the goal, to understand how that unfolded over that 25-year period.
What would you say, what were your findings?
So do you want to jump in, Linda, or should I?
Well, I think that the findings were kind of what you'd expect, but they were a little bit, they're challenging to some of the ideas about what we think about how the schools will bring success to everybody. And what we found was there was a big discrepancy in the end between the people who came from the more challenged backgrounds. They ended up, very few of them actually graduated from college. The society, we think, completing school, going to college, that's the goal. We had only like 4% of those kids completed college, whereas the more advantaged kids, almost half of them, 45% of them, had completed a college degree at the end of this 28-year period. So I think one of the good things about the study was it was a longitudinal study, so we were able to look at how advantage and disadvantage accumulates over time. And what we were seeing this, the people from more disadvantaged backgrounds started school at a certain disadvantage. They made the transition into first grade when not as successfully. More of them were retained, more of them were in special education as compared with the more advantaged kids from more advantaged backgrounds, and that continued throughout. They ended up being in schools that were more segregated and high poverty, and in the end, they didn't participate in the kinds of pre-college programs, and so it wasn't unexpected that in the end they were less likely to graduate from high school. Actually, the surprising thing was most of those kids had a lot of high aspirations, and the ones who did graduate from high school, close to half of them actually did at some point go to some post-secondary education, but very few of them could complete it. So there were all these kinds of barriers. That is the kind of thing, and those barriers are very much connected with the family they were born into, the educational level of the parents, the economic opportunities the parents had as compared with the higher, more advantaged parents. So that was kind of, it goes against what we think that education, that actually family background is so important in terms of how kids will eventually end up.
So that's the family background is so important. Linda's quite correct. That's the imagery of the long shadow, which is the book's title. It's the long shadow of family background, the conditions of family life, which also spill into neighborhoods and schools. Conditions of family life when children are just getting started cast a long shadow, and that they move children along these very different kinds of life trajectories. In school, as Linda just reviewed, very few of the poor children in our study group completed college, although a goodly number of them started down the college path, that they weren't able to complete it. That's half the story, and the book has a lot to say about the particulars of why we saw those big disparities across social lines. But the other half of the story has to do with employment opportunities for these young people who did not go to college. Since only 4% of the poor kids at age 28 as young adults had a bachelor's degree, and if you add in the community college degrees, it goes up to 5.5%. So not many of the low-income children, in terms of where they started out in life, are going to be moving on as adults with the benefit of a college degree. You know, they don't have that piece of paper that's going to help open doors for them. So another large part of the book, which was really almost a process of discovery because we didn't go in anticipating this. We thought we were going to be doing a book about schools and how schools can be the launching pad for success and where it falls short. But what we discovered as we got into the looking at all the information we compiled is that for the non-college bound, which is the vast majority of poor kids, not completing college, the opportunity to find a good job with steady work that pays well was also not available to everyone in like measure. And it turns out, this is so vivid in the experiences of these youngsters, but we didn't realize it until we saw it. White men of working class background had a decided advantage in terms of their employability in the non-college labor market. And so when it comes to success in school, what we saw was a story about the advantages that middle-class children and middle-class families have in terms of their academic performance. What we saw when we looked at the experiences, the work experiences of those who did not go to college, the advantage fell to white families, and those advantages were particularly apparent in the experiences of the sons, who managed to find employment in what I think of as the remnants of Baltimore's industrial and manufacturing sector. So there are these two, what we call success narratives. One has to do with doing well by doing well in school, and the other has to do with doing well by getting a good job that pays well and offers steady work. And the kinds of folks that can take advantage of each of those two, they're very different kinds of opportunity structures for middle class advantage on the one hand and white working class advantage on the other hand.
So it's really this whole idea of the American dream, and with a good education as being this leveling playing field that everyone has the same opportunity for success. What your findings would suggest, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that's really not the case. That's
aspirational. I mean, we all ascribe to that. We say we'd like to think that this is the land of opportunity, that if you work hard, you play by the rules, do what your parents tell you, do what your teachers tell you, then good things will follow. And we would like to think that we're able to deliver on that promise, but in point of fact, the reality is that it falls short. And we know that from the experiences of our study youngsters, but we also see very much the same picture nationally and in other research. So we have a long ways to go as a country and as a community in honoring that promise that we make to our children. So yeah, it's the meritocratic ideal that people who do the right thing realize the rewards of that. But for too many of the poor kids in our urban areas, and also rural poor, but we don't study the rural poor, but in places like Baltimore, we fall short of delivering on that promise. And we fall far short. It's really quite something. There's a whole host of things that can be done. It's what's so sobering is that I think we know what we could do to afford greater opportunities for many of these young people, but we don't use that knowledge very effectively. And what we see is it starts early on. So we know from the research evidence that a high-quality preschool experience can help more poor children arrive in kindergarten or first grade ready to learn. So in our study, when we look at the test score differences from school records, the poor children on average at the very beginning of first grade are a half grade equivalent behind in reading comprehension. It's a foundational skill. If you can't read well, everything else becomes challenging. At the end of elementary school, at the end of 5th grade, that half grade level shortfall, achievement gap, has exploded to 3 grade levels over the course of elementary school. On average, there are always exceptions, but on average, the typical poor child at the end of elementary school, at the end of 5th grade, just before transitioning to middle school, might be reading at a 3rd grade level or a 4th grade level, whereas the average middle class child might be reading at a 6th grade level, being ahead of grade level. So that 3 grade level disparity in something as fundamental as reading comprehension does not augur well. It's not the kind of thing that you can easily change later on, because it's such a huge gap. And so one implication of that is you have to start early so that you're not trying to figure out how to remediate, but you'd rather be able to prevent. So if more poor children can come to school at par, close to, with readings, with a skill set that's comparable to what non-poor children have when they start school, then maybe you can help them out along the way. It's easier to help them keep up rather than having to figure out how to help them catch up. And so things like a strong preschool experience, strong after-school experience in the elementary school grades or all the way through, summer programming that helps them avoid what's referred to as summer slide. What we know from our research, and as well as the wider literature, is that poor kids lose ground during the summer months when their learning of these fundamental skills is dependent upon what's available to them in their families, where their parents don't have the resources or the understandings to help them move ahead during the summer, but middle-class kids continue to build up their skill set over the summer. So strong summer programming can help poor kids keep up better. And then within the experience, while they're at school, things like health screenings so that you can pick up on undiagnosed. So many poor kids come to school with hearing issues or vision issues or dental issues or asthma or consequences of exposure to lead paint. If they've got these health challenges that aren't being addressed, then everything else becomes even more challenging. So we know a lot about the things that we can do to help poor kids academically. And what we don't do, sadly, as well as we might, is put that knowledge to good use in effective programming that's sustained over the course of years, all the way through. Because the challenges outside of school that hold poor children back don't go away just because they've had a good summer experience one year. So there's the next year, and there's a year after that. And so we really they need, and we as a community need a sustained commitment to playing a more helpful role.
I hope that it is a call to action, and I think it's obvious that there are many ideas out there of solutions to a lot of these problems. It just takes commitment and trying to put things together in a coherent picture. Not just focusing on the schools themselves exactly, but looking to the families, looking to the neighborhoods, looking to the larger community to see how they can contribute to the solution. It can't be just one magic bullet, but I hope that there's a realization out there that there's potential if you just kind of have a larger vision and a positive vision.
Well, Carl Alexander, Linda Olson, thank you so much.
That was the Grawmeyer Award winners in education with my colleague Kim Butterwick doing that interviewing. And I know it was a little bit of a lengthy interview, but I thought it was important to hear what those two winners had to say. Thank you all for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.